G'day guys, what's going on? Welcome to this episode of Aussie English, the number one podcast for anyone and everyone on wanting to learn Australian English, culture and history. More Australian culture and history today than English, although it's in English. Anyway, so today I had a sort of interesting story for you guys. I had been chatting with a guy online named Ian Carpenter, who is today's guest, and this was a few years ago. We got chatting, I think, about a film called Sweet Home, which I actually never got round to seeing. We were chatting when it was, I think, getting hyped up to be released, and it was an Australian film about Indigenous affairs and issues and history. And so I was chatting to him then, and he recently contacted me again, probably a year and a half after our first contact, and was like, hey Pete, do you want to catch up sometime and we can chat about things? We could do an episode on the podcast. I'm also an English teacher, so it'd be great to catch up. So anyway, today, Ian and his student Anna, who is from Brazil, came down to our house in Ocean Grove and had lunch with us and hung out. And we started getting into a pretty deep conversation. I heard all about how he ended up being an English teacher, although I wasn't recording it at the time. This was just banter over lunch. Damn, should have kept it. It was a really good story, really interesting story. But I wanted to get him on the podcast to talk to him about being a fellow Caucasian Australian who has a passion for Indigenous history and culture. I wanted to get him on the podcast to talk about Australia, Australian history, as well as Indigenous Australia and Indigenous Australian history. Obviously, this is from the point of view of two Caucasian European heritage guys, so, you know, take it with a grain of salt. We are still sort of learning a lot about Indigenous culture, but I sort of wanted to give you guys a window into, I guess, what it was like for us as European Australians growing up in Australia and the kind of exposure we had to the Indigenous part of Australia, as well as the average Australian's views of Indigenous affairs in Australia. Anyway, we kind of just set off and started talking about issues and our opinions. Take it for what it's worth. I hope you get a lot out of it, guys. There's some interesting topics in there. I'm sure you'll get a load of different language out of it, and you'll also hopefully learn a bit about Australian culture and history, Indigenous Australia, and yeah, hopefully a lot more. Anyway, let's get into it. I give you guys Ian Carpenter. Welcome to the podcast, guys. This is an impromptu podcast. Kel's sitting in the background. We have a special guest here in the background too, Anna. But I have Ian Carpenter. I've said that right.
You have.
Take it. Ian Carpenter. And yeah. Noah screaming in the background. And, well, do you want to... How did you end up here today, Ian? So, let's just start from the start.
Well, I've, like many other people, I've discovered your videos and your podcasts, and I think we actually spoke a couple of years ago. I'd seen a comment you made somewhere online to do with...
Hopefully a good one, not a bad one.
No, I think it was... from memory, it had something to do with a film called Sweet Country.
Yeah, I don't think I actually got to see that in the end because it was before that was released, right? This was a movie about Indigenous Australians.
It's a brutal movie, and I really recommend you see it.
That's the most annoying thing about Australian films. They're so hard to find online, especially and like to remember when they're going to...
Yeah.
You hear all the news when they get first hyped up, and then I always tend to forget.
Well, I always recommend to anybody living in Australia to tune into NITV.
Yeah.
Channel 34.
Yeah.
And all of these movies will eventually pop up. And not only that, but there's so much going on in Indigenous Australia, in literature, in art, in television, in movies, in so many fields. Indigenous people are excelling, and you'll see it all on ITV, on NITV, I should say.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to talk to you about Indigenous people today eventually, but we can dive into that first.
No.
I kind of had my mind blown by that recently because I guess as an Australian growing up in suburban Australia, probably in a town of 99% Caucasian British heritage Australians, you don't really come across many Indigenous people, and so your view of quote unquote Indigenous Australia tends to be pretty skewed, right? I mean, I don't know what it was like for you growing up, but I was definitely, as a white Australian privileged male growing up in this safe, well-off neighbourhood, it's difficult to really understand what it's like as life as an Indigenous person in Australia. And I recently read a book called Australian Aborigines. I've forgotten the author. I'll have to include that later on. But that was like reading a play of someone screaming at you for like 20 hours. Like that was just brutal after brutal after brutal moment in there. So I guess, how did you first sort of learn about, how were you taught about Indigenous culture growing up?
Well, I wasn't, basically.
Because that's what I was going to say.
I grew up as you did,
that, right? Yeah.
in the privileged Australia, and it wasn't until, in my years of school, we saluted the Union Jack, we sang God Save the Queen, and we were taught that everything started with Captain Cook.
I think my version of that was everything started with Captain Cook, except now it was the Advanced Australia Fair national anthem and the Australian flag. The British Australian flag. If you
Well, Peter is now showing up my age, you see. But anyway, when I was travelling over in Europe, when I was living in Europe in the 70s, in particular in Spain, I was often asked about Aboriginal Australia. What did I know about our first people? And I was often embarrassed to say that not much.
And this is why I've wanted to talk about this on the podcast more, because I've had a lot of people ask me about this. And besides feeling incredibly unqualified, both in experience and knowledge, to really comment on the topic very well. That's why I thought it would be good to have other Australians on here. Hopefully in the future more Indigenous Australians, although they're pretty hard to find around Ocean Grove where I currently live. Although I hear Kathy Freeman lives here somewhere.
You'd be surprised, actually. There are Indigenous people scattered all throughout Australia that, as we were talking before, you don't always know. Yeah. You can't always tell.
By just looking at them.
And most Indigenous people, even if they're a small percentage Indigenous, they still feel Indigenous.
But it's almost a hard conversation to have too,
It is.
It feels like anyone of any other race, it can be quite difficult, especially as a white person, to really try and ask them about what it's like, or, of that race, or to learn about their culture, because it tends to come from a position where you feel like you don't have the right to ask that, right? So in Australia, was it difficult when you did start learning more about Indigenous culture?
No, but I had to make a conscious effort to do that. When I came back from overseas, it was something I was determined to do. Yeah. And one day in the early 90s, I read one day a pamphlet from Melbourne University showing what courses were available or coming up, and there was one there called Understanding Black Australia, and it was a course by a guy called Gary Foley. I don't know if you've heard of him, but
the surname rings a bell.
In Aboriginal Australia, he's a kind of a Che Guevara. Yeah. I
don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, though. It's hard when Marxist thinks that Che Guevara is a hero, but I think...
No. Let's just say he's a freedom fighter.
Okay. Right. And so he's got a bit of good and bad in him.
Yeah. Well, and Gary Foley's actually, he's now Dr. Gary Foley. He's finally completed his studies at Melbourne University, which he's been doing for many, many years. But in the days of the tent embassy in Canberra and
that's the world's longest ever protest, by the way, I think 40 years or something, right?
He was right there in the forefront of that. Yeah. And he was in the forefront of the bicentennial protests at the
1988, was it?
At the Commonwealth Games in Brisbane. Yeah. And he's been fighting for Aboriginal people forever.
This is how ignorant I am. and probably a good representation of the average Australian. When I went to Canberra and I saw the tents set up in front of old Parliament House, I had no idea what it was. Totally, I was like, why are there all these homeless people out the front of this, in the middle of this field where there doesn't seem to be much going on? It's an old building that's no longer used.
Yep.
And only later, after I actually moved away from Canberra, because I only ever saw this thing from a distance, I realised that it was a protest, an Indigenous protest that had been set up there in the 80s. Is it? Maybe even earlier than that.
No, it was the 70s.
Yeah, 70s. Okay.
Yeah, and
there's been people there ever since. Right?
Yeah, pretty much. It was removed and then they came back, and I mean, it was brutally removed at one point.
I think I remember.
There's a lot of archival footage that you can source on YouTube and on the usual sort of places, but it was a part of an ongoing struggle which has been going since the beginning of colonisation. But anyway, I decided I was going to do this course. It was a week-long course at Melbourne Uni, and it was one of the best things I've ever done in my life because...
How was it set up?
It was basically just in one of the lecture theatres in Melbourne Uni, and it was just Gary at the lectern, and there were about 30 of us in the course.
Yeah.
One of the people on the course who I got to spend a bit of time with was a lady called Judith Durham, who was the lead singer with the Seekers.
Oh, really?
Yes. And she had, the Seekers were no longer a group at that time, although since then they have got back together and with a lot of success again. But she was very interested in learning more about Aboriginal culture, and she had also had an education similar to ours, but she knew there was more to it, and she wanted to learn more. And
why do you think it is that we had that education growing up? I often think, like, why were we not taught more about Indigenous Australians, do you think, in the classroom?
Well,
is it partly too because they're kind of like not one monolithic unit? You have hundreds of quote-unquote Indigenous Australian groups, right? They're not just Indigenous Australians.
No, they're not.
They're hundreds of different groups with different languages, with different cultures, different beliefs. And so it's pretty hard to just go to school and learn about all Indigenous people, right?
That's true, but and it's very complex. I mean, the thing that I often come back to when I think about it is that we're very much a nation which is we've still got the training wheels on as a nation. It's only been 230 odd years, and about the first 100 years we were still pretty much an outpost of Britain.
Yep.
It's not until 1901, federation, that we actually became a nation under our own name with our own flag, and we're maturing. We've been maturing ever since, and I believe that right now we have reached a stage where we are sincerely believing that we've done a lot wrong when it comes to Indigenous Australia. And I believe that there is a groundswell of average Australians who would like to right those wrongs. And so things are changing. And as I said before, despite everything, Indigenous people are excelling in so many fields. And, we now have, I think, 5 representatives in the Parliament and the Senate. We've had, serious discussions about treaties and serious discussions about changing the constitution, and
because until what year were Indigenous people still seen as flora or fauna?
68
in the constitution, right? So,
68.
Yeah. So was that 50 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean.
And they got the vote way after Australian women got the vote, right?
Yep.
So Australian women had suffrage in the early 1900s, and meanwhile, Indigenous men and women were like, hello.
That's right.
Can we have a say?
That's right. And I mean, the Indigenous servicemen after the First and Second World Wars came back to Australia, and unlike their white counterparts, they got no help with housing. They weren't welcome in the RSLs.
Yeah.
I mean...
well, and some of the stuff they were given, I was reading about a few guys who returned, I think, from First World War, and they would often be given land like the other soldiers, but it would be completely garbage that they couldn't grow anything on. And then even when they tried to make a go of it, quite often the land would be taken back, or they would be forced to sell it, and so they were oppressed kind of... I guess it would be like indirectly in a lot of ways, whether or not it was someone coming to them with a gun and saying, you can't do this.
Yeah.
It would be that there were constant hurdles set up in the way of them, where for other people that wouldn't be the case. Like, I think when they were stockmen, I was reading, that was one of the most atrocious things. They became stockmen in the late 1800s and early 1900s in parts of Australia where they absolutely dominated at their job. They were doing an amazing... they had an amazing set of skills, and they could work as hard as anyone else, but they would be paid a fifth or a tenth what the average stockman would be paid, who wouldn't work anywhere near as hard as them, and it was simply because of their race.
That's right. And I mean, a lot of Australian people would be familiar with the Paul Kelly song "From Little Things Big Things Grow."
About Mabo, right?
No.
Is that about Mabo?
No, that's about a stockman's strike.
Okay.
The Gurindji.
Yeah.
In the Northern Territory, they were stockmen working for a wealthy British landowner who was paying them a pittance.
Yeah.
And they decided that they weren't going to take it anymore, and they went on strike.
Petition, right, for more money eventually as well, right?
Well, it started out that way, but it grew into basically the first land rights claim. They realised that they were being ripped off not only financially, but they spent a lot of time sitting in the dust thinking about their...
Oh, what was the name of the guy? Lingyari?
Lingyari, yeah.
That's who I'm thinking about, not Mabo.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's is it a suburb of Canberra that's named after him these days?
Could be. I'm not 100% sure.
Somewhere
there's a lot of Indigenous named suburbs around there.
Yeah.
So.
But that's a famous story, which it's pretty well told in the song "From Little Things Big Things Grow," which was written by Paul Kelly with in collaboration with an Aboriginal singer-songwriter whose name escapes me right at this moment.
You guys all know the song, though, because it gets played all over the place, right? And covered by a lot of people, too.
Absolutely. Kev Carmody is his name. But that was an inspiration to many people, and it was, as I said, the very first of the land rights claims.
Yeah.
And they succeeded. But it took years.
Yeah.
They literally sat down in the dust and thought about their plight and said, this is not just about money. This is about much more than money. And they eventually won with the help of some good-hearted white legal people from Sydney and Melbourne. And I might add, with the help of Australian trade unions who had heard about what was happening, and as is usually the case, the trade unions were prepared to stand up for the workers, and so that's a famous episode in this tragic history. But getting back to the week I spent with Gary Foley, that was really enlightening.
What did you learn about? What was he mainly trying to sort of educate you on? Or just everything?
The course was pretty straight down the line, understanding Black Australia.
But what does that mean, right?
It just means...
in terms of their history? Or their oppression?
It touched on all of those things, and it was delivered by someone who had experienced all of those things. Yeah. And it was just incredible because so much of what I learnt in that week was new to me. And yet...
That's kind of embarrassing in and of itself, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
And that's how I feel every time I find out new things about Indigenous culture. And, you're just kind of like, why haven't I ever been told about this?
Yeah.
Or why haven't I ever been in a position where this was easy to learn about?
And in Aboriginal history, there are many great people, Albert Namatjira, Charlie Perkins, Mabo. There have been many great leaders and many great people that have fought for their people in many states, in many places. And as you mentioned before, Aboriginal Australia is a very complex thing. There are many languages, many tribes.
And people want different things.
That's right.
This is what blew my mind. I watched a 60 Minutes story the other day with Pauline Hanson going to Ayers Rock because she wanted to climb the rock. For background knowledge, Pauline Hanson is, I guess, a right-wing nationalist in Australia. I don't really know how to describe her other than that. She's very controversial.
We will be polite.
Yeah, she's considered to be incredibly racist, although to give her the sort of benefit of the doubt, I hear her saying many more ignorant things than I think explicitly racist things when she says stuff. But anyway, she went to Ayers Rock, or Uluru, and wanted to climb it before it gets closed in October. And the weird thing about seeing this was that she went and she explicitly spoke to the elders there and asked them permission to do so. And the elders will, at least from the perspective of the report, were saying they want it to stay open because they want tourist money there and they want these jobs. And then when Pauline went to, I think she was at a restaurant or a hotel, there were all these Indigenous women working there as managers and waiters and stuff. And they were like, no, we need to close it. It's offensive. And, this is just horrible. And she was like, are you from this part of Australia? And they were like, no, we're from, way up north in Darwin. And she's like, but how can you have this view of land that isn't your land, that's these people's land? This is what they want, but you want this other thing. And then too, when she said, well, where do you think I should, I'm as Australian as you guys. I was born here. And one of them was like, no, go back home to England. And she's like, I'm not English or whatever. And so it's weird that you have this, both sides can tend to be a bit bigoted, but also Indigenous people can want mutually exclusive things, which make it even more complicated, right? Because you do have people hoisting the flag saying we shouldn't climb Uluru because it's a sacred site and it's offensive, and I think my opinion now would be, whether or not I can, I'm probably not going to ever do it because I don't need to. I can walk around it, right? But at the same time, there may be people who are Indigenous, who are from that area, who want that thing to, go a different way from the loudest voices. Yeah. And that's what makes it so screwed up, right? A lot of the time, these things have conflicting sides. And it's hard, I think, in today's day and age too, with this sort of the rise of the leftism and what do you call it again? Identity politics. It's very difficult to know whether people are genuinely trying to do what's best for a certain group or a certain area, or if they're trying to score moral points. And so it is very bizarre because I think we get that conflation, right? When we ask Indigenous people, what do you want regarding this thing that is, say, Uluru, that actually should only involve the people whose land it is, you get very different conflicting points. So I can imagine it's very difficult to really work out what's the best thing to do.
That's right. But
it's a hornet's nest.
It is. But Aboriginal people are no different to every other kind of people in that they will always have differing views.
Yep.
But I have been to Uluru, and the experience of being there left me in no doubt that it is a sacred site. And I felt ashamed to see all these people refusing to reading the signs at the base of the rock that are in every possible language, asking you not to climb it. And for those very reasons, that it's considered a sacred site. Those signs were put there by the people of that area, and the disregard that so many people have for that was just shocking, and so they've come to this conclusion after many years of trying passively to ask people politely not to do it. They've just come to this conclusion that, all right, we just have to stop people from doing it. And apart from anything else, it's really dangerous.
Well, Pauline didn't even get to the top, right? She crapped herself because it was windy. And people have died on there. They've had heart attacks, they've slipped, all sorts of stuff. You're probably more likely to die on Uluru than get eaten by a shark.
And also, by the time you get to the top, in the heat,
in several hours, right?
And you've been drinking heaps and heaps of water, when you get to the top, there's no toilets, there's no facilities whatsoever. So, and you shouldn't be behaving like that in a place that is considered sacred. I wouldn't go and climb all over the Vatican. I wouldn't go
and take a dump on the roof.
I mean, so
it is pretty weird to think that because I think a lot of the problems too is like pollution. People crap on top of it, piss on top of it. It ends up getting into a concentrated kind of mess, right? And then it rains and it goes down into the water systems and poisons those, and so it is a big problem.
I had a similar feeling when I walked around Machu Picchu, or when I walked around Granada or Cordoba, or places where that are just so stunningly beautiful, and so and yet this is something that was not created by man. It's a natural phenomenon, and it's something that is to be, I felt in awe every time I went near it. Morning, noon or night, I just couldn't take my eyes off it. It was just an amazing...
And ironically, the interesting stuff's probably all around the outside anyway,
it is.
Not on top of it.
It is,
and the thing that you've gone there to see is Uluru, and the moment you get on top of it, it's the only thing you can't see.
And to see what everyone sees from above, I saw that in a light plane.
Yeah, exactly.
I went up in a light plane.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you see even higher, right?
It cost me a couple of $100, but it was just the most amazing... and I could do that without, without going against the wishes of the people, and it was just an amazing experience which I'll never forget. But Aboriginal people have been swept aside, they've been ignored.
I think that's the biggest problem, right? That people aren't explicitly asking them what they want a lot of the time. They just want to be heard and to have autonomy. And I think whether we're trying to help them or trying to oppress them, quite often the autonomy is taken away from them, right? And they're told what they can or can't do. Some of the biggest things for me to sort of work out whether I'm for or against is, say, making alcohol illegal in certain towns. Because you're kind of like, we would never imagine doing that to any other race in Australia or any other group in Australia, and yet we do it to the Indigenous people in Australia. Although I think most of the time they decide that's what they want to do, in the town. The elders or the people on the council end up choosing that to happen. But that's sort of more of that complexity, right? Of like, you have one set of rules for one group of people and one for another, and how do you ever get out of this system?
Well, I think Aboriginal people ought to be viewed as a very special case, because I can't think of another race on earth that has been as dispossessed as they have. And so
the Native Americans would be on the same sort of level, wouldn't they, to some extent? Some of the ones that live on reservations.
Well, you have to remember that Native Americans signed all kinds of treaties, and they had all kinds of arrangements, and they ended up on reservations and places because that was what was decided in consultation with them.
Until it was found there was gold on those reservations.
Yeah, exactly. But in our case in Australia, I mean,
they were just never asked.
They were never asked. They were, as we know, up until 1968, just considered flora and fauna, and so were not worthy of an opinion.
Yeah.
Not worthy of an opinion. So, you know, as tragic as it is, as I said before, I feel very positive about how things are heading at the moment. I just think that there are more and more people who are understanding, beginning to understand, and doing as I did, learning a bit more. The more you learn about Aboriginal people, the more incredible you see them, and I mean, really, more than anything, we have lost so much by having this attitude. You know, there's so much to gain from embracing them and bringing them in and making them a part of what is. We all know that this is a great country.
Yeah. It
could be so much greater.
Do you think that's why
that's what's missing? That's really, in many ways, it's the soul of our country.
Do you think that's why it's been a bit of a stain on our history for a long time?
It's a massive stain on our history.
Yeah,
it really is, and you know, and in so many ways we have such a great history, but our focus has been in develop at all cost, you know, like all the imperialists in history, we've chosen the best places to build our cities on the coast. And so the Aboriginal people that were at Sydney Cove and the Aboriginal people that were in places like...
Pretty much anywhere there's a big city, those people no longer exist.
That's right. Those people were just pushed aside.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And...
For whether directly or indirectly, right? I remember reading about that in the book, and it being in Sydney Cove, for example, they were there for a long time, although it was a matter of the British setting up shop and being like, so this is where we live now. You guys can, you know, live outside of here, but this is where we live. And then the cattle and the sheep pushing out, destroying all the land where they were fishing and all of the grasslands and everything, so that they were pushed out further. Diseases going through and massacring people, you know, smallpox and everything. So whether it was a direct thing or an indirect thing, they were constantly pushed outwards. One of the interesting things I was reading about too is that they were quite often mortal enemies of other clans and other tribes. So I think they had a basic rule, broadly speaking, that if they could speak the same language intelligibly, they would be on good terms. But if someone spoke a language they couldn't understand, the assumption was enemy kill them, because it's safer than, you know, trying to just get by when you can't communicate. And so quite often these tribes got pushed off their land and further outwards until they were constantly in conflict, not with just the Australian or the European settlers, but also with the other Indigenous people that they were being forced to interact with.
Yep. And, you know, I mean, anyone who has grown up in Australia and has enjoyed the wealth that the country has produced in, you know, whether it be from mining or from sheep or from whatever, needs to consider that this has all taken place on land that was never ceded. And we also need to consider that that our beloved country was founded on a lie, and that lie being terra nullius,
empty land,
which we all now know to have not been the case.
Well, I think they knew at the time.
Of course they knew at the time.
Yeah.
But it took many years later and a few scientists to disprove it. Which the lie that was known fully well. Yeah. No, it's...
there seem to be all of these sorts of things, though, right, where it's like, we're here now, so what do? You can't change anything.
No.
Right? And yet, you get a lot of hate towards British colonialism, but had it not been the Brits, it would have been the French, or it would have been the Dutch, or it would have been the Portuguese. It would have been another group that would have come in and done the exact same thing eventually. And so it's so hard to work out what's right and what's wrong. And then on top of that, there's a layer of how do we make it right by channeling the wealth of Australia back towards the Indigenous community without further screwing it up, right? Because if you say with the inherent problems that a lot of communities currently have with violence and drinking, if you were to just throw money into that community without controlling it in one way or another, it may make things worse, right? But at the same time, if you were the kind of person who's a bit more libertarian and you say, well, people should have the right to do whatever they want, you might say, well, you don't have the right to tell them they can't drink or they can't, spend their money on whatever they want. So it seems like that's also such a difficult thing to work out what the best course of action forward is, right? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I do, and I think that what a lot of money over the years has been thrown at Indigenous affairs in one way or another. But very little has been achieved with the consultation with the elders or with the people of whatever place, whether it be the Northern Territory or Far North Queensland or West Australia, and that is pretty much what Aboriginal people are saying today is, we have the answers, they are saying. We know what our people need. And I believe that they are a special case.
Yeah.
I don't subscribe to the view that everybody should be treated the same.
Yeah.
I think this is a special case.
Yeah. But I guess that's the difficult thing, right? Because you may have people in Australia who are in effectively the same circumstances as another group of people, but because of their race don't get treated the same. And that's where, at least on my sort of level, that's what seems difficult for me to justify it. But I can understand it, but at the same time, it's tough when you're at the level of, saying, well, this person's a different skin colour from you, so they deserve, X and you don't. It
would all have been so much easier if we had have done the right thing in the beginning. I mean, look at New Zealand.
Yeah.
But
I think too with New Zealand, they had to make an agreement, right? They were fighting the Maori, who were a warrior group of people and were one homogenous kind of nation, right, as opposed to a lot of conflicting nations, and posed a significant threat.
Well, I think the first settlers in Australia couldn't believe their luck, when they ran into such a passive people who, they were able to bribe them with sugar and tea and things like that. And
they were getting paid with that for quite a long time, weren't they?
Yes. And it really is a tragic story, but...
Another aspect of that that's really tragic was the way that the women were treated, right? Whether indirectly or directly of their volition, quite often because the women could be obviously used by Indigenous and British or immigrant men. They quite often ended up having children with those men. The children were treated differently by both sides. And so it led to all these other more complicated, relationships and things happening with the people that further decimated their kind of...
That's right.
Their homogeneity, right?
Yeah. And, one of the things which eventually came out and is common knowledge to all Australians today is the stolen generations, you know, and
do you want to give people a bit of a history background on that quickly, if you can?
Well,
just the basic idea of what happened with the stolen generation.
Well, it was, to be as nice as I could possibly be, it was well-meaning. The powers that be at the time believed that by taking black children from their, or Aboriginal children from their families.
Quite often who tended to be what we'd call at the time half-caste, right? They had a white parent and a black mother.
But not exclusively.
Yeah.
But in many cases...
But that was justification quite often, right?
It was.
We need to save these half-European children.
That's right. And so many of those children were taken from their families and taken, in many cases, a long way away from their families.
You guys will see this in Rabbit Proof Fence, the movie, if you want to check it out.
Rabbit Proof Fence, yeah, absolutely. A fabulous movie. And in many cases, those families were never reunited. And you can imagine that those families suffered immense grief from that separation. And
it was a cultural warfare to some extent, right? Where
absolutely.
They wiped out language, wiped out culture, because the children were banned from speaking that culture. They were quite often put in a place where other children had different languages, so they couldn't communicate with them but for an English.
And you know, there are people who believe that one of the reasons for doing this was not only to benefit those children, to give those children a chance of a better life, but the idea was also to speed up the demise.
Yeah, the breeding out of the black people.
Breeding out. And I mean, a lot of people in our history, people who are regarded in our history as, you know, celebrities or people of great wealth and I'm trying to think of the name of what was Gina Reinhardt's father's name? Lan Hancock.
Yeah. Okay.
Hancock.
Yeah.
He had the idea that and this is common knowledge. This is, you can access this in Wikipedia or wherever you like, but his idea was to poison the water to speed up the demise of the Aboriginal race.
Yeah, there's a few stories like that, right? Where they were poisoned by white people.
And he today is considered a great Australian because he made billions and billions and billions of dollars mining the land that was never seeded. You know, and I mean, recently Australia lost a man who was considered to be a great Australian. In Tim Fisher, he was a leader of the National Party for many years, and he was a very, very nice man. But he was one of the people who, when the Mabo decision was up in the courts and it looked like it had a chance of succeeding, he was one of the people who was warning Australians that Aboriginals were coming after their backyards, you know. And yet, you know, he was a great Australian. I felt quite sad when I learned the news that he'd passed away. But I just couldn't help but think, you know, why would he do something like that?
You would imagine.
Yeah, I mean,
and embarrassment and
as we now know, the Mabo decision was successful. That was something that Aboriginal people went through the courts for well over a decade fighting that, and eventually they won. And as far as I know, nobody has lost their backyard. You know.
Just one guy, but we don't care about that guy, you know.
Yeah.
He
so you know, I mean, through history, there has been a lot of opposition to any kind of leg up to Aboriginal people.
Yeah.
There seems to have been a desire on the part of people in power to rub their noses further into the dust.
Yeah.
You know?
It's so complicated because I remember in some of the stuff that I was reading too, there was a very rigid hierarchy in tribes, right? Where the elders were obviously the conduits of knowledge, and so everyone had to bow down to the elders. But the moment that colonists came in and started giving away things that were of great value in these tribes, like axes and everything, all of a sudden the younger guys could now, get a lot more power a lot faster and sort of undermine the tribal structure as a result. And so, it was and the same when I think they started working full-time jobs as stockmen, all of a sudden men disappeared and the tribes broke up and people went to different places, and you had men who were now self-sufficient at a younger age. And so it was so interesting to find out how at least Indigenous culture as it was in Australia prior to us arriving was inevitably disrupted by capitalism and the way in which our society's evolved, and how you reconcile that today is so difficult too, right? Because we want to help Indigenous people become wealthier, become better off, move up in quote unquote societal class or whatever, but how do you do that without education, Western education, so that they can flourish in Western society, but which requires quite often the loss of their own culture, at least to some extent, right? Or their own language skill, or their own understanding of their land, because they have to move to Sydney for a substantial part of their young life or something. And that's what I find I'm so conflicted, because you're kind of like, on one level you want to say, we want to conserve what you guys have and we want to encourage that, but at the same time we're saying, but really we need you to become like us and leave that behind. And so it must be so difficult being an Indigenous person too, in isolated parts of, say, the Kimberley or Darwin, and deciding, do I identify as wholly Aboriginal and I want to stay here forever and do this, or am I looking for opportunities to better myself and my current situation and have to leave part of this behind and have to make a choice, right? That must be a rock and a hard place.
Well, there are some amazing Aboriginal people that are managing to do that.
Yeah.
They've been through our schools and our universities, and they've risen to very high levels of journalism or, many fields, and they have become very powerful spokespeople for their people, and they have a really good understanding of both cultures. And one of the things that we could learn so much from Aboriginal people about is family.
Yeah.
Family is everything to Aboriginal people, and that is why Aboriginal people often refer to each other as brother and uncle and auntie, and they feel they all feel part of the same family. And also I believe it has, because as we touched on before, the stolen generation, so many Aboriginal people are to this day still feeling lost because they've never regained that connection. And it's not like the stolen generation is something that has something that happened in history and now it's all over, it's all healed. It's not, it's still going on.
Still rolling out.
Absolutely. And
well, I said when I was looking into Indigenous languages, especially in Victoria, I had an interview with a guy who was, I think, the person in charge of the conservation of Australian languages somewhere in some part of Melbourne, and he was saying it's a really tough thing to try and talk to people about, especially in Victoria, because the languages have all gone extinct, even though the people are still here, and so they, rightly or wrongly, might blame you or be offended by you wanting to learn that language or learn something about it because it's been taken from them historically and they no longer have access to that or that knowledge. And so it's one of these things that's like, ooh. And that's what's so hard, I think, today with all the languages in Australia, that I think there's still 250 or so of them, but I think only 15 of those have more than 1,000 speakers. And so we're going to lose a lot of them pretty soon. But at the same time, there's no push for it to kind of, the government's not doing a lot, I don't think, at least from my limited understanding, trying to conserve these things and encourage the passing on to the next generation in schools and that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, there are pockets of hope as far as that goes. There are some schools that are doing things off their own back, you know, if they have the community around.
I think in Central Australia, a lot of that's happening around Alice Springs, right?
Yep.
And in the Kimberley.
Yep. And I think that, you know, Aboriginal people know that education is the key.
Yeah.
And you know, we know that as well.
It's putting the two together though, right? Like trying to really foster the culture and their language, maintaining that, but at the same time giving them the skills to be able to flourish in today's society as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And the problem, I guess, too, is that you have a huge number of different groups that aren't just Indigenous Australians in terms of one homogenous group. You have Indigenous Australians of all these different tribes from different parts of the country that want different things that may be at different levels of integration into, you know, quote unquote civilization, where they don't necessarily need your help, or there's other ones that are isolated from everyone and need massive amounts of help.
Yeah. But I think I come back to the thought that I do believe that Aboriginal people have a special case in Australia. I don't think we can think that everybody must be treated the same. You know, I do believe they are a special case because they have been dispossessed of everything over such a long period of time, and it's really going to take, you know, I mean, our prisons are full of Aboriginal people. A lot of work needs to be done there, you know. A lot of those people, if they don't get some kind of a break, if they don't get some kind of rehab in a serious way, they're just going to continue. The cycle will just go on and on and on.
Well, the funding needs to be put into the communities, right, to prevent them from ever going to prison for whatever reason they're ending up there, right?
Absolutely. And this idea that you can't do, you know, you can't give everything to Aboriginal people, or that you know, they're no more deserving than some other part of the community. It's just crazy because. You know, I mean... I
guess it's one of those questions, too, of where you can probably do the most good with the least amount of probably resources, right? Or at least in a very short period of time.
Yeah, but as we started off with in this conversation, I do believe that the groundswell of Australia, just everyday Australian people, is growing stronger and stronger all the time. And as with most things...
do you think that's due to the internet?
Sorry
to interrupt you there.
No. It's probably got a lot to do with that.
Yeah.
And knowledge.
Yeah.
Well, the internet helps with all of that. And
because you can imagine, I guess, back in the 1800s, 1900s, even when my parents were born, it wasn't so much that people were actively trying to oppress Indigenous people. I would imagine that 99% of Australians just knew nothing about it.
That's right.
And there was nowhere to learn about it unless they dived into books in a library that were probably written by someone who had an agenda.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll say about Aboriginal people, and this is a really practical thing that every Australian can do, is, you know, go out of your way, make a point of meeting some Aboriginal people and getting to know some Aboriginal people. You will find that they are, you know, they are very funny people. They love a laugh. They're very sociable people. They love the fact that you're interested in their culture. You know, just do yourself a favour and you know,
How would you suggest people do that? Anyone listening right now, if they were saying, you know what, Ian, I'm going to go do that tomorrow, what would be the way of doing that?
Well, there are, depending where you live, but there are groups, there are reconciliation groups, there are, if you are involved in a sporting club, there are likely to be Aboriginal people involved in the sporting club. If you're, you may have an Aboriginal person at your school. You may go on holiday to, an area where there are Aboriginal people. Well, just don't stay in your hotel with your, in your comfort zone with your, white Australian friends.
iPhone out. And
yeah. And also for people living in Melbourne,
yeah.
I should just mention that there is a fantastic app that people can get. It costs about $5. But once you've got it for life. It's called Melbourne Dreaming.
Yeah. So what does it say here? A Guide to Important Places of the Past and Present by AIATSIS. That's the Aboriginal Australian Institute right up in Canberra.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
And that's a fantastic app. It shows you places of interest around Melbourne, lots of stories you can listen to, lots of little guided tours you can do. You can explore so many things around Melbourne. And also in Melbourne at Federation Square is the Koori Heritage Trust. A Koori is a name for an Aboriginal person from Melbourne or from the southern states of Australia.
Yeah, it's sort of surrounding. It's all the clans of the surrounding area here in Victoria, I think. Yeah.
Yep. And as far as South Australia as well, but not the West.
Yeah.
And could be even into southern New South Wales. But it's just a name.
I remember Koori cream.
Yeah.
I used to have as a kid.
Yeah.
And it was a brand of hand cream, and my mum was obsessed with it because it was like really, really good. And then I think they went out of business or it disappeared. But I remember I think that was where I first learnt the word Koori cream.
Right.
Yeah.
But at the Koori Heritage Trust, which is in Federation Square, there's a gallery there which is constantly changing. A lot of young Aboriginal artists get to display their work there. There's a lot of historical archival material there. There's a shop where you can buy all kinds of Indigenous wares.
Made in China.
No.
Yeah.
No.
And I said that because I want to bring up, make sure if you guys are going to buy Indigenous products of any kind, make sure it's not made in China, because a lot of those places, say if you walk down Swanston Street in Melbourne or probably, the middle of Sydney, you'll see a lot of these souvenir shops, and most of the stuff they're selling is made in China. Yeah. So it's ripped off, or it's made in Indonesia or something. So make sure that the money's going to Indigenous people.
Yeah, well that's another thing. In more ways than one, Aboriginal people have been ripped off ever since colonisation, and that's one way that they're being ripped off today by their incredible art. But also you can do special Indigenous tours around the Royal Botanical Gardens in Melbourne at different times, especially around NAIDOC Week, which is in July. But they do at other times of the year as well. And the other thing I was going to mention was, yes, you could, if you would like to try some Indigenous food, there is a restaurant in Gertrude Street, Fitzroy, called Charcoal Lane, which is a training school for Indigenous students of hospitality.
Oh, cool.
But it's also an active restaurant.
Yeah.
And pretty much the menu changes all the time. You can go online and have a look at it.
And it includes Indigenous food only, or just partly on the menu there?
No, well, mostly things like sauces and condiments and all that sort of thing are made from what we call bush tucker.
Yeah, brilliant.
And
What's
also,
bush tucker for those who don't know what that is?
bush tucker is basically food that is produced from wild
Plants or animals?
plants. Yeah.
So tucker means food, right?
Tucker is an Aussie expression for food.
Yeah.
And they will have on the menu, most days they'll have wallaby, occasionally they'll have crocodile.
Oh, brilliant.
Barramundi. It's a great place, and it's been going for a long, long time. It's ironically, it's housed in what used to be the Venereal Diseases Clinic.
Just ran out of business, did they?
in Gertrude Street, Fitzroy.
Yeah.
But it's a fantastic restaurant, and all the people that are working there, the chefs and the waitresses and waiters and the admin people, they're all trainee Aboriginal or Koori students, and it's also quite an educational experience because there aren't just all these things on the menu that you eat. You can learn about all the different ingredients, and you can buy ingredients.
So a big thing here is just show curiosity, right? Be interested in Indigenous culture, Indigenous people, Indigenous languages.
Yeah.
And just don't be afraid to dive in and try and learn more about it and make connections with people.
Yeah, and don't just sit at home and watch whatever comes up on the telly. Switch on to NITV, Channel 34, and you will find night after night, day after day, incredible programs, documentaries, sports, movies, all kinds of, even children's programs through to dramas, soap operas. There's every kind of program being made by Indigenous people in Australia. Mm-hmm. And it's a 24/7 channel.
Yep.
And I think it's all over the country. It's not just Melbourne. It's all over the country.
34, yeah, that's been around a long time, I think. Yeah, it's just...
And NITV is National Indigenous Television. And I think I'm not sure whether the main studios are in Sydney or whether they're in somewhere like Alice Springs. I'm not sure. But in any case, it's one way that you can, from the comfort of your home, find out a lot more about Indigenous Australia.
Oh, cool, Ian. So last question, I guess, before we finish up. If you had a magic wand and you could, make any changes that you wanted to try and level the playing field, what would it be? What do you think needs to be done? What are the biggest changes that would lead to the best results?
I think if the people in power, the people that have the power to make big changes, could be more respectful and take more seriously the opportunity that we have as a nation to really mature, to really come of age as a nation, that would go a long way towards truly becoming a very, very special place in the world. I mean, we are already a very special place in the world, as we all know, but we could be so much better.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, Ian Carpenter, thanks so much for coming on.
Cheers, mate.
Anna, you too, in the background quietly the whole time. All right. Thank you so much again, Ian, for coming on the podcast. It was an absolute pleasure having you down for the day. I had a lot of fun. It was great to meet you. It was great to hang out. Guys, I hope you enjoy this podcast. Again, take it with a grain of salt, take it for what it's worth. This is just sort of our personal views and our experience learning about Indigenous culture and our views on Indigenous culture. I definitely have a great deal more to learn on this topic, and I'm going to hopefully get some more Indigenous people on the podcast in the future, because obviously it's much better to hear from the horse's mouth than from mine. But besides that, guys, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a great week, and I'll chat to you soon. Peace.